Right, what is up, my friends? Welcome to week three's concluding video. We spent our week this week discussing, among other things, the new wave of immigrants that arrives in the United States, really as a consequence of Gilded Age industrialization. We also discussed the ways in which those immigrants, as well as domestic migrants from inside the United States, are increasingly settling and moving into newly growing American cities. So today's conversation is going to be really focused on three really important lanes of response to this new immigration. The way that society responds and reacts to and adjusts to the new reality of what it means to have this large group of new immigrants present in America, as well as this new arrival of not arrival, but this new growth of large-scale cities. So really what we're going to talk about today is responses to immigration, urban reform, and the growing middle class, all as three things that are combining to create a new culture and society in American cities. So as we think about the way society responds to immigration, it's important that we put this in three different buckets, three different categories of response, okay? The first group that we're going to talk about today are the sympathizers, those in society that are looking to sympathize with the new immigrants, find ways to support the new immigrants, some with pure positive motives, others with selfish motives. We'll talk about that though as we get there. So first we'll talk about the sympathizers, those that are looking to assist the new immigrants. The second group we'll look at are the nativists, the groups that are anti-immigrants, the groups that are actively working to oppose more immigration and support for immigrants. And the third group we'll look at is the immigrants themselves. How do immigrants work to assimilate in some ways, maintain their culture in other ways, and overall just adjust to society as a whole. So first, the sympathizers, we're going to talk about the ideology of the social gospel. Social gospel we can really look at, if you want to talk like through continuities in American history, this is kind of like the third Great Awakening, right? We're talking about the first Great Awakening in the colonial era, the second Great Awakening in the antebellum era. This is not called the third Great Awakening, but in a sense, it's going to function kind of like a third Great Awakening. And what it's going to be is a societal belief of the Christian faith that argues that Christianity is not just a belief system, but it is a system of action as well. Meaning, one doesn't just get saved by believing in Christ. One gets saved and acts as a true Christian by acting as Christ. Really, it's kind of the love your neighbor as thyself ideology. And with that, the social gospel ideology here in the Gilded Age is going to demand that practicing Christians work to reform society around them, work to help and assist those in society, the neighbor, so to speak, who needs help. Really, the social gospel is going to give us the birth of what we consider today to be social work. Workers actively attempting to address the social needs of those in society who are less fortunate. And the specific way most of this work is going to be done is via what are called settlement houses. And settlement houses are very appropriately named because they are large houses that are designed to help immigrants settle into American society, American culture, American life, the American economy, etc. These settlement houses are going to provide things like daycare, English classes, and classes and other things that might make immigrants more employable and more comfortable in the American way of life, teaching job skills, teaching how to assimilate, teaching how to adjust to American life. And these are largely going to be built and established in poor, immigrant-heavy neighborhoods in these new cities like New York, like Philadelphia, like Chicago specifically has a good number of the most famous and well-known settlement houses in history. The best one I can give you, which we'll talk about in a second, is Hull House. But the people working this ideology, working this type of work, are largely urban, educated, middle-class women. And this is going to be a really important thing for us to maintain thought process-wise for the rest of the semester, is the influence of women in reform. Now, if you think about it, this makes good sense, right? Because as we talked about last week, and we'll talk about here at the tail end of today's video, we have a growing middle class of people who are comfortable in life, not rich, not poor, but comfortable. And women don't really have an avenue, right, to use their comfort politically or economically. So it makes sense then that women are using their excess money, their excess time, their excess energy, their excess passions to work in reform movements like settlement houses here. So these urban middle class women is one of the main continuities to think of throughout American history of reform movements. The same was true with antebellum reform movements, right? Temperance women, education reform women, prison asylum reform women. Abolition was largely influenced by women. So this is a good continuity to hold on to there. And the best example you should know, it's good SFI for you, is Whole House. Whole House is established in Chicago by a woman named Jane Addams. Jane Addams is the person we most associate, name association-wise, settlement houses. Jane Addams settlement houses. Whole House is the best example. And for many of these women, this work in working to establish settlement houses and support immigrant assimilation and adoption to American culture really becomes the launch point, the beginning point for additional social reforms that we're going to see in the next time period. Our next time period we're going to discuss, the very beginning of period 7, is called the Progressive Era. And in the Progressive Era, again, we're going to see women largely dominating the demand for social reform and reform programs. And really, it's the settlement house movement that becomes like the motivating launch point for that movement. Here's a great picture of Jane Addams. They're at Whole House, hanging out, teaching a variety of poor immigrant children, likely from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, who have settled there in Chicago. There's Jane Addams, to clarify. She's the old one. There she be, Jane. Good old Jane Addams. Now, the next group that sympathizes with immigrants are political machines. Now, it's important that we clarify here that this does not mean that political machines are good necessarily. It just means that they're looking to do what they can to support immigrants. Now, I talked about political machines at great length in our live lesson this week. But if we think about political machines also not just as a political entity, but as a social entity that is responding to the social needs of immigrants, then we can see how they can be characterized as an immigrant sympathizing type of organization. Now, why? Why do I consider them this way? Because they're providing services for immigrants, right? Whether those services be housing, apartments, and finding places to live, jobs, food, supplies when needed. Political machine bosses are known to show up at a needy family's front door with a basket full of groceries when needed. So the political machines are stepping up to fill the void that is left by the local government's inability to provide social services to people. So they're filling a need in social services. The only difference here is that they're doing it like with a caveat. They're doing it so that on the back end, you vote for their candidate and they get to maintain their hold on power. So the political machines, unfortunately, are often going to exclude groups. Chinese immigrants, for example, African-American migrants from the South who are moving north to cities, not in large numbers yet. That'll happen much more so in a couple of years. But those that are largely excluded from the political machine network and system. And it's important to note that their motives, why they're providing these services, aren't quite as pure, I put in quotation marks, as settlement houses, because they're providing these services as an exchange, not because it's the right thing to do, like the social gospel is arguing, but as an exchange, meaning we're going to give you this, but you're going to vote for who we tell you to vote for, to ensure that the political machine candidates maintain their political power so they can keep up their ability to give jobs to their supporters. All right, this is a continuity of the spoil system from Jackson. If we keep the political machines candidates in office, they can keep getting the contracts to their friends for city projects, for bridges, for buildings, for this and that. So really it ends up being this entire system. And one element of the system is that immigrants and other poor people in cities are given the support services and the jobs and the housing that they need. So in that case, we can consider them immigrant sympathizers with a catch, right? With a little bit on the back end for them. It's a good example of the continuation of the spoil system, which we talked about way back in the Jacksonian era. That idea of government officials should give jobs to their supporters because they supported them. Right? To the victor goes the spoils. All right, it gives us this good political cartoon from the Tweed Ring, Boss Tweed, the Tammany Hall political machine of New York City. And the question is, who stole the people's money, right? And the whole ring they have of all these different people, right? Carpets and carpenters and gas pipes and awning, all these different services that are being given jobs because they support Boss Tweed, right? And somebody's stealing money, somebody's getting rich off of this progress, and they're all pointing at each other as the person that actually stole the money. So again, this just shows really the downside, the alternative view, the negative aspect of political machines. Now we're going to pivot to the groups that are not sympathizing with immigrants, this perspective of nativism. And as a reminder, because this is not the first time we've talked about nativism, but it is the most recent time we're talking about nativism. Nativism is a strong continuity in American history for all sorts of waves of immigrants. Nativism is quite simple. Right? It is support, belief in the value of native-born Americans. Native-born Americans. We laughed sadly, a sad laugh, at that propaganda poster we saw back in period 4 for the conference. It was a text for about a conference for Native American, and we're like, well, that's Indians. Well, no, they're trying to argue that Native American means native-born American, in an anti-immigrant type of sentiment. This belief in nativism is of course seen elsewhere in American history. In the antebellum era, the late 1840s and the 1850s, with the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, the American Party being their official name, the Know Nothing Party being their informal party name, same thing. In antebellum America, this is not the same as racism, right? Because there's not preference for a race over another race necessarily, but it's similar ideologies in that there's the in-group and the out-group. The good humans and the inferior humans. So it does operate on a similar inferiority, superiority type of dynamic as racism, but with a slightly different twist, if you will. In this case, it's dominated by a few things, but one of the main things it's dominated by is fear of the Pope and fear of Catholic domination. There's this worry in America that all these immigrants that are coming that are Catholic, they can't be loyal to the American political system because they're already loyal to the Pope. There's this fear of Catholicism as an idolatrous social and religious order that worships the Pope at the expense of social order. And thus there's this belief then that Catholics can't be integrated into American society because of their loyalty to the Pope. And because so many of the immigrants are coming from Italy and elsewhere in Southeastern Europe that are Catholic, we see this fear being a dominating factor in the nativism that dominates the Gilded Age. It goes so far as to see the American Protective Association being formed, which is an advocacy group that is specifically targeting Catholic immigration with negative stereotypes. Next thing that's concerning for nativists is the different ideas on government. When we saw the old wave of immigration with the German immigration and the Irish immigration, at least in Americans' minds, those people understood the ideas of modern representative government. But many of the people that are coming this wave of immigrants are coming from nations that are practicing socialism or anarchism, or nations that are undeveloped, and thus they don't have the grasp of understanding for what representative government means. This idea of like, I'm going to vote for you and then you're going to represent me and the common good and the like, right? This is one of the reasons why political machines are so effective at targeting these new immigrants, because they have no problem trading their vote for services, because they're like, I need services. Here's my vote, of course, right? Which is, of course, a betrayal of the democratic system, but with a people that have not been brought up in the ideals of republicanism and representative democracy. Sure, a vote is just something else they can barter to get what they need. Don't blame them. Completely understood. So that because this new wave of immigrants is from nations that don't practice representative democracy, there's this fear that they're going to bring these radical ideas like socialism and anarchism and later communism to America. Sounds a lot like some of the criticisms of immigrants today. What do you know? And the thing that ties all this together is social Darwinism, something that we talked about last week. But this philosophy of social Darwinism is going to be used to justify why the immigrants have it so rough, why it's okay to not treat the immigrants well, why it's okay that they live in terrible housing conditions and they don't have social services and the government does not support them or uplift them, because to do so would be to violate the laws of science and the laws of nature that says survival of the fittest. Really, it would be doing, it's not what I'm saying, it's what they're saying. Really, it would be doing society a disservice to provide resources and supports for these people because it violates the ideas of evolution. So social Darwinism ends up being the justification for why it's okay for the immigrants to have it so hard, and on the flip side, why it's okay for the people at the top to have so much money, so much wealth, so much power, so much influence, so much control, etc., because they've earned it, because they're obviously the most fit, is the thinking here. We do see this facilitating actual legislative actions, actual acts of Congress to work in a nativist way. In 1882, the federal government bans any immigrants who are considered criminal or excessively poor. Those are the language in the law. Those criminals can't come to America anymore, nor can people who are excessively poor, because they'll be called what's called wards of the state. Wards of the state, which means the countries have to take care of them, so why should they come here? They can't take care of themselves, is the argument. Pardon me, it's early. Later, in subsequent years, Congress is also going to ban polygamists, people who like to practice multiple wives. Let me tell you from experience, one wife is plenty. Alcoholics, and people with illnesses. Any of the ill in society can't come as well. So we're seeing American immigration policy start to get a little bit more selective. This will carry into our next unit in a pretty significant way. So I want you to be able to latch onto this as the beginning of something, right? Just like last week in class with our industrialization lesson, I emphasized to you the Interstate Commerce Act not being great at regulating businesses, but it was the beginning of something, right? This is going to build to something greater in the next era. That's positive, the regulation of big business. In this case, not so positive. The regulation of who can come in and being really selective about immigration is going to build to a much more robust immigration reform that we'll talk about into 1920s and period 7. Same year, we see the first federal regulation, first federal banning of immigration for a specific group of immigrants, and that's the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of the darker examples of American immigration policy, when Congress says for 10 years, no Chinese immigrants can come. 10 years later, they renew it for another 10 years, and then another 10 years, and then they later renew it indefinitely, meaning it just stays on the books so that Chinese people cannot come to America as immigrants. And that is not overturned, it's not changed until the 1960s, which is kind of crazy to think about. An American society today that, of course, has a great number of Chinese immigrants and Chinese nationals who have been born here of Chinese descent, that just as recently as the 1960s, they weren't allowed to come for an 80-year period. This philosophy gives us this cartoon, which I think is one of the better perspectives in a political cartoon in American history, drawn by Kepler, Jacob Kepler, as we see this new immigrant, right, crossing the bridge, coming into America and being stopped by all these well-dressed fat men. And as we've talked about before, right, the idea of wealth and power is seen often in political cartoons and the size of somebody. So these powerful, rich men who are well-dressed and living it up here in America are saying, no, you can't come. You can't come, right? And we see, though, there's shadows behind them, right, which is supposed to represent their past, their history. And we see that they, just like this new immigrant, at one point were here coming to America with just the clothes on their back, working to find a new way in life. And it's a reminder that America has always been a country of immigrants. And when we see people that benefited from this, then later pulling those benefits away from the next generation, the next wave, it's quite heartbreaking. The basic caption here is they would close to the newcomer the same bridge that brought them over. And Kepler makes a good point here that at some point everybody in this nation has been an immigrant, and except for Native Americans and indigenous Latinx people. And here we see the ramifications of people being unwilling to extend resources, help, and benefits that help them to whoever comes next. Good cartoon. We also see these two fantastic perspectives that I included in your notes just so you can take a good look at it. The Chinese wall around the United States of America, right? This idea of and this is the Know Nothing Party kicking over this immigration ladder, so these Chinese people can't come into the United States anymore. It's just a depiction of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and a nice little play on words for the Great Wall of China. And then we also have, just as noteworthy, this fantastic brief history of American immigration and racist policies, as this Chinese immigrant is looking at the wall and seeing all this anti-Chinese rhetoric, like the Chinese must go, the Chinese problem, prohibit Chinese immigration, laws providing for their banishment, right? And we see the Native American looking at this and being like, oh, what, immigrants? Immigrants are bad? What do you know? Like, here I have been having to fight white immigrants for my entire existence. Right? And there's some other good elements of this cartoon that I'd like for you to look at. See down below, obviously, that what was in the past is anti-Irish immigration, the lager beer government. We must have this idea of down with the Irish, down with the Dutch. So it just goes to show how immigration policy changes over time to exclude a different group, but the big continuity is anti-immigrant sentiment. The caption at the bottom says, "Every dog, no distinction of color, has his day." So meaning that every group has their moment of experiencing nativism at the hands of native-born white Americans. And then here we have in the back corner an African-American man saying, "My day is coming." So it's a good perspective, a good way of depicting the hypocrisy of American immigration policies. Both of these are drawn by the same cartoonist who we talked about last week with the political machine exposures, Thomas Nast, who is as good as it gets at expressing social situations and contexts with little cartoons. He's actually the same cartoonist who gave us that really powerful, really chilling, this is a white man's government with the KKK and the White League holding hands over the scared black family at the end of Reconstruction. So good cartoonist, good to note his commentary, which is evident here in his cartoons. Next group that is anti-immigrant is organized labor. Labor unions are actually going to be quite vocally anti-immigrant for a pretty obvious reason, right? Labor unions are built on the idea of solidarity, that there's strength in numbers, that the labor unions all together, right? One for all for one. And what's good for one person in the labor union is good for everybody in the labor union. And immigrants break this because it's job competition. Right? If there's 100 of us and we say, give us a raise or we quit, right? Well, that's powerful, right? That's 100 people. How are you gonna replace 100 people in a factory? Well, if there's a lot of immigrants that are coming to America, like your work gets more and more and more and more replaceable because of the volume of labor that is available in American society. So because immigrants provide job competition, organized labor is going to be pretty vehemently anti-immigrant. Right? These are, most people in labor unions are working class citizens in urban areas. And the jobs they are working, the jobs they're trying to either get or keep, are also attracting immigrants who could potentially work those same jobs for cheaper, right? They're going to make less demands of industrialists for pay raises and for shorter working hours, right? The idea is that the immigrants are more quote unquote desperate for the work, so thus they're going to be less demanding of better treatment, better hours, better pay, better working conditions, etc. Unfortunately, oftentimes language and cultural barriers, as well as nativism, keeps immigrants from joining organized labor. Which leaves organized labor as largely mostly native-born organizations. The next reason is immigrants are often used as strike breakers, meaning when people in a big factory all say, we're going on strike unless you give us $3 more a week. We're not working until you meet our demands, right? So they all walk out, they all go on strike, they're out there picketing with their signs, $3 more a day, $3, whatever it is. And then The factory owner can just pivot and be like, all right, cool. While you're on strike, the whole point of the strike is to hurt the industrialists by not producing anything. Right? That's the whole point of being on strike. While you're on strike, I'm just going to replace you with a bunch of immigrants who are going to come in the factory and just keep working. But now the strike doesn't work anymore. The strike's now ineffective. The strike has been broken because of immigrant labor. And when this happens, instead of blaming the industrialist for going to immigrants to replace the labor, society instead blames immigrants for being willing to quote unquote cross the picket line, is what it's called, cross the line and break the strike. This increases anti-immigrant sentiments among the native-born working classes. Right? This piece of press is helpful. Boycott, members and friends of organized labor. Notice is hereby given to Mrs. Geo Althoff, proprietress of the Will House at the corner of Arizona and East Broadway. She defies organized labor. She goes against what we wanted, and she continues to patronize Chinese. So guide yourselves accordingly, and this is the Silver Bow Trades and Labor Assembly. Just one example of a labor union trying to use their power in numbers and influence and strength to push a nativist philosophy. Now, the immigrants themselves, assimilation is much more difficult for this wave of immigration than it had been for the first wave. It's difficult because of different language, different customs, different religions, and immigrants are going to create cultural compromise. We're going to see immigrants holding on to their home culture by settling in ethnic neighborhoods like Little Italy or Chinatown. In these ethnic neighborhoods, oftentimes there's organized schools that are delivering education that is focused on home culture, so language and customs, etc. They have likely their own press, which is publishing newspaper articles on events in their home country and events in their community here in their native language, while also engaging in American influences, right? Attempting to learn English and get jobs and participate in the American system. We do see that children of immigrants, and this is, I would argue, a cultural phenomenon that we see over and over again in American society, are much more eager to Americanize and immerse in American culture. And oftentimes this eagerness to abandon their home culture to become American is expressed through entertainment and activities and the like. Right? This gives us these two different theories for how culture is developed in America. The melting pot theory, meaning all these people come into America and they all get melted together into one big culture that we just call American. Much like if you throw a bunch of cheese in a pot, different kinds of cheese, and you melt it, you can't tell which cheese is which, right? I often use in class the smoothie analogy. Right? If I make you a smoothie in the morning, which I would love to do if I could ever see you all, make you a smoothie in the morning and I put some blueberries, right? Some strawberries, maybe a banana, some Greek yogurt, maybe some spinach, because spinach is good. And I bring it to you in class and it's a smoothie. And, when you use I don't like spinach, I'm like, well, then take it out. Well, you can't because it's a smoothie, right? That's the idea of the assimilation theory. Whereas the pluralism or the salad bowl theory is much more so if I made you a salad with lettuce and onion and tomato and some croutons. And one of you was like, I'm gluten-free. I can't have croutons. And well, that sucks for you. And you can just pull their croutons out and still eat the salad. In that case, this is the idea that everybody merges together into one big American culture. And this is the theory instead that each culture has its own place, and it's not all melded together into one uniform type of culture in American society. Some of these questions of nativism are resolved in a very important Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, decided in 1898. Now, Wong Kim Ark, he's a children of Chinese immigrants. Children. God, terrible. He's a child of Chinese immigrants who was born in the United States. And in his young youth, he travels back and forth to China a few times. Now, as you know, 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act is passed. So on one of his return visits from China, he's not allowed back in. He says, sorry, Chinese immigrants are not allowed into the United States anymore because of this act. And he's going to argue, I'm not a Chinese immigrant. I was born in America. I'm just coming home. I'm from here. I may be Chinese, but the act excludes Chinese immigrants. I am a native-born American of Chinese descent. He's going to argue that his citizenship is protected by his place of birth because he's born in the United States. He's an American citizen. And this ends up being a kind of a tricky question. As the Supreme Court, it shouldn't be a tricky question, it's pretty straightforward, and the courts rule in his favor. They agree. Because the 14th Amendment, that Reconstruction Amendment, guarantees birthright citizenship. Those who are born here are entitled to citizenship and cannot be uh, uh, they can't lose their due process of law based on race, color, previous condition of servitude, and the like. This is important because it means that the 14th Amendment, it's the first time we've really extended this in law. The 14th Amendment applies to more than just formerly enslaved individuals, which is how it's passed in the first place. But the language of the amendment is native-born Americans. And in this case, Wong Kim Ark is a native-born American. And that really does a lot for advancing the ideas of birthright citizenship to more classes in America than just white and black. And that ends up being a pretty important precedent for all the ways of immigrants and the children of immigrants that come later. That does not stop the racist and nativist perspectives. This in a San Francisco newspaper, Lady Liberty serving dinner to a white family and being interrupted by a pretty disgustingly drawn Chinese individual that says, "Is it right for a Chinaman to jeopard a white man's dinner?" The idea being that idea expressed here is that citizenship should belong just to white Americans, and it's not right for Chinese people to expect the same type of society. So I want to pause here and allow you the opportunity to make some connections, because this is what's going to be required of us in the second semester as we don't just learn information, we apply information. And these three elements that we've talked about today all have roots elsewhere in American history. The first, and this is the way you become much more successful on AP-style tests and college-style thinking, is by taking what you're learning and applying it forwards and backwards to other elements of American history or elsewhere. Social Darwinism, for example, doesn't just apply to treatment of immigrants, but within this time period, it also applies to the justification for the consolidation of wealth, for why Carnegie can be so rich, for why Rockefeller can be so rich. So it's important that you don't get yourself in the lane of this applies just here, it doesn't apply anywhere else, because this applies elsewhere in this time period. Those robber barons that we refer to, right? Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Jay Gould, etc. But this idea of social Darwinism also applies to manifest destiny. This idea that God has granted America the right to expand implies that Americans are better than who they're expanding at the expense of. Right? Later, social Darwinism is going to also apply to the ideas of imperialism, as America is going to look elsewhere, outside the continent of the United States, for more land to expand to, with the same justification of we know best, we're more suited to govern you than you are to govern yourself, so here we are America. You could also make an argument that social Darwinism is quite related to John C. Calhoun and others' arguments that slavery was a positive good for the slave, for the enslaved. This argument that he presents in Congress that you guys read in class, that you saw the cartoon of, right? The Negro in his country, the Negro in America, where savage, no shirt, right? And the family's all nicely dressed in the house, being civilized and cultured. This theory is quite similar in its ideological roots to social Darwinism. The next thing we can think of forwards and backwards is women and reforms. Right? Women played a significant role in the antebellum era reforms that were inspired by the Second Great Awakening. Prison reform was dominated by women. Dorothy Dix. Temperance was dominated by women. Education reform, abolition, women's rights with Seneca Falls and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Right? This is not women's first foray into the social reform arena. This is just the latest foray into said arena. Moving forward, I know we're not there yet, but we can start building our webs. Moving forward, the progressive era is also dominated by women reformers as well. The third piece is about immigrants and assimilation. I think that there's other areas in which we see this ideology present in American history other than just immigrants in the Gilded Age. Just as recently as our first lecture on this in this unit was Indian Wars, the closing of the frontier, and the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act, this attempt to civilize and assimilate Native Americans into white culture by giving them land and farming and education, and Carlisle Indian schools to educate American Indians on the American way with Christianity American history and the like, is another example of assimilation applied elsewhere. Even the Trail of Tears, this idea of removing Native Americans, even though they had assimilated, which goes to show, like the Cherokee are one of the five civilized tribes, and they're removed anyway, even though they meet all the requirements of being assimilated into something of an American culture, and they're removed anyway, which goes to show that assimilation can only go so far. And even the Freedmen's Bureau schools, these attempts to, while very positive in intent, these attempts to educate and uplift African Americans, former slaves, in the American way of thinking and learning and doing life. So go ahead and take a second, because this is a good chance. This is how you'll be graded on this assignment. To write my thesis, evaluate the ways individuals and institutions responded to the growing influx of European immigrants and domestic migrants during the Gilded Age. Go ahead and pause it, write your thesis out, and then we can move on. Moving along. The next element that's taking place in cities as well is the growing middle class. And I alluded to this at length in our industrialization our industrialization live lecture in week 2. But this growing middle class is going to be pretty important for the development of American culture and society. Now, the wealthiest in America are the top 1%. And that top 1%, crazy enough, controls a quarter of the money in the United States. 1% of the people controls 25% of the wealth, which is just insane. It's just insane. But beneath them, there's this new growing class of middle class people. And these are people that aren't working, laboring in the factories, but also don't own the factories. They're this management class, this class that has they're not only working one job, they're not working 70 hours a week. They have some leisure time, some free time outside of just work and sleep. They have some spending money because they only have to have one good job. They don't have to work a second job to make ends meet. It's this new middle class that's going to really dominate what becomes the mainstream American culture in cities. A couple of key causes. The first cause is post-Civil War expansion of educational opportunities. A bunch of new colleges are opened. A bunch of new opportunities are made available throughout the nation. A couple reasons. One is the Morrill Land Grant Act passed by Republicans during the Civil War, which grants land to states to build public colleges. And because of this expansion of education, we see the use of this education to work new jobs. There's new jobs that are created by industrialization in management and administration. What used to be like a small individual-owned factory, be like one guy owning a factory and 3 guys working for him, right? Small. Now with the rise of corporations, we need this new class of what are called middle managers, right? Analysts and trainers and all of these people that are using their job skills to facilitate work without doing much of the work themselves. New jobs for men, what we consider white-collar jobs. White-collar jobs are jobs in which you can wear a white shirt to work and not get dirty. Educated workers are using their training and their knowledge to administer and manage and oversee the factories and other industrial work, while women are doing what we consider pink-collar jobs. Jobs, they're called pink-collar because they're like white-collar and they don't make you get a bunch of grease on your hands. But they're called pink collar because they're traditionally associated with women's work. Secretarial work, telephone operators, etc., some budget work, counting, for men and women that have gone to school and can then use their education to work these types of jobs that sets them apart from the lower classes. At the end of the day, it's just educated people that are filling new jobs and then rising themselves up to this middle class of society. So they're not poor. They have some spending money. They're considered middle class. Now, this leads to a couple important effects. One effect is a growing gap between skilled versus unskilled labor. Right? What used to be owner and workers, right, is becoming wider and wider with skilled laborers in the middle and then unskilled down below. This gap is widening. We talked about in our live lesson in week 2, Taylorism and scientific management being one reason for this. That's one consequence or effect. The second is the expansion of consumer culture and entertainment in cities. The circus becomes a thing as traveling circus with animals and trapezes and all kinds of entertainment in the big tent goes town to town to town to entertain people who have some disposable income to go do these things. Boxing matches, baseball games, plays. Cities become a hotbed for new forms of entertainment in a way that we still see today. right? With concerts and movie theaters. And I mean, at some point we can go back outside again. This also creates the need for escapism as cities are going to begin building like parks, like Central Park in New York, which is the most famous example, or suburbs out of the city. As those people who are working in the middle class who can afford it don't want to like live and work and operate and be entertained in the same space, but rather to get out places and get a little more nature in their urban dominated life. And this middle class has more free time. So this middle class is kind of tying back to the settlement house idea. This middle class is going to be more engaged in social reform and political activism because they have the means, the money, and the time and the energy to put forth towards reform types of movements. Here's some good examples. In the city, it's Central Park, New York, a little parade of horses and carriages. This here on the right is one of the first in the 1890s, one of the first football teams in American history, which is quite amusing to look at. I've got this dog. It's always a dog. Told you guys. Apparently this is a football, which looks more like a basketball, but here we are. This guy's about to play ball in his suit over here. Tom Brady's got nothing on that guy. So go ahead and take another pause and use everything you've learned up to this point. Tell me, like, to what extent was the Gilded Age an era of economic opportunity? Right? And to successfully answer this question, you might want to say, like, it was an area of economic opportunity for blank because of blank and blank. However, it was not for blank because of blank. All right. So you're going to want to structure your thesis that accounts for complexity in a way that you can say, like, it was good for them, not so good for them. Here's your chance to start like using real good critical thinking in your writing. The last thing to talk through is urban reform. There's a lot of problems that exist in urban areas during the Gilded Age. I would like you to think through for just 10 seconds. What are some of the problems you can come up with on top of your head that exist in Gilded Age urban settings? All right, let's see your list. My list: poor working conditions, local government corruption, the Tweed Ring, political machines, etc. Hunger, pollution, disease, poor, crowded living conditions in tenements, poverty and crime. A lot of problems in society. Whose job is it to fix these problems? Who should step up and fix these problems in society? You might be thinking, well, that's what the government is for. And I would be in agreement with you. However, the answer is not the federal government. Why? Because it's the Gilded Age and the federal government does nothing except pass out jobs to their supporters, pass high tariffs, and fight about currency. Talk about that next week. The federal government is absent on social issues. They do not get involved at all on any of these issues, which we consider all social issues that are largely found in cities. So as a result, churches and individuals are going to work to attempt reform on these urban problems. And because it's important to note that churches and individuals are limited in their influence, their power, and their reach, reform is quite limited. Reform is quite limited until the federal government decides to get involved. And that's going to happen next unit in what we call the progressive era. Right? Protestant churches are going to work to reform things. Women are going to work to reform things. And then last, a brief thing you should know called the City Beautiful movement is going to work to reform things. So the Protestant churches, again, are going to profess that idea of the social gospel, use the teaching of Christ, love thy neighbor, to address urban poverty. They're going to try to attempt the ideas of salvation as an act, with doing good work as an act, much like the antebellum reform movements were inspired by the Second Great Awakening. And thus, they're going to center reform as a moral issue, right? Not a logical issue or an issue that we need to do for efficiency's sake, but a moral issue for our times. Unfortunately, reforms via the social gospel are limited and localized, meaning it's only in places where there's a strong Protestant presence, a strong church presence in which these reforms are going to take hold. Women and reform. Women are working to address the lack of social services like crowding and disease and filth in cities, and general gender inequality, another continuity as well. As women start working on reform issues, think Second Great Awakening, abolition. As women are working to advocate for others, they're like, hey, wait a second, what about us? We're not even included in this nation's fabric. So while we're working to fix this problem, let's go ahead and get ourselves some rights while we're at it. Settlement houses with Jane Addams and Hull House are working to address the first problem of social services and crowding. But women are beginning to use the skills they're developing elsewhere, either in jobs or in settlement houses or in other sorts of social reforms, in education and schools, to begin being more active in groups for their own equality as well. The most important one to know is NAUSA, National Association for Women's Suffrage in America, organized by kind of the remnants of Seneca Falls to pick up the pieces of that attempt at women's equality and keep marching forward for women's suffrage. The impact, more successful. Women play a pretty big role in what they're able to do here, as settlement houses do make a good-sized dent on for the immigrants they help and support for the transition to American culture, and they lay a groundwork for future social work. Additionally, though, maybe the bigger impact is that for women, this engagement in politics and society becomes really a stepping stone towards progressive reform that women are going to play a lead role in, like abolition of alcohol and direct election of senators, as well as later, at the very end of the progressive era, women's suffrage, which is achieved there at the end of the 19-teens with the 19th Amendment. So, women, keep it up. Good work. The last element of attempted reform in cities is called the City Beautiful movement. Now, cities grow so fast and so chaotically that the cities are often a jumbled mess of alleys and streets and tenements, and it just becomes a chaotic environment of filth and disease and growth. So the City Beautiful movement is an attempt to address the overcrowded and chaotic nature of urban life, to ensure that cities grow in the future with a little more foresight and planning into how they grow. The solution for this problem becomes urban planning or zoning. Today in society, for example, like you don't see a bunch of factories and then a house, right? Like there's industrial zones, residential zones, commercial zones where you can have stores and the like, places for parks and green spaces, and then suburbs as well that are just for residentials and housing. And this is a lot. The name responsible here that you should know is Frederick Law Olmsted. He's responsible for all sorts of really important city developments, the most important being Central Park in New York City, which is carved out of a giant chunk in the middle of New York City with this huge urban park, which if you're ever in New York City, you should go wander around because it's beautiful and quite amazing to have a park of that size in the middle of the biggest city in America. A good comparison for today would be like Grand Park in downtown LA, right? A big green space that's in the middle of an urban atmosphere. Here's some pictures. We have the mall in Washington, D.C., which we just saw an inauguration at, right? The Capitol building, Washington Monument in the middle, and the Lincoln Memorial down over there. This idea of planning an entire city around open green spaces here as well on the top right. I'm not quite sure what city that is, but you see what originally was green space in the middle of the street with cars on both sides is even maintained to today with a more modern picture, still keeping green space in the middle. And this here down in the middle is the world's Columbia Exposition in Chicago. This idea of celebrating all the world's achievements in 1900, the tail end of this period, with a giant fair that's organized and planned in Chicago as well. So that does it for our responses to urbanization and immigration. Hope that was helpful. Make sure you respond to those good thesis questions. Take a look at some of the cartoons that I included in your handout because they're helpful to understand the discourse at the time of what was taking place. And I can't wait to see you for our live session next week. Love y'all.